People who born deaf, how's your inner voice sound, or you just speak sign language in your head? My mom is profoundly deaf and I asked her this same question, totally not a stupid question. She said she thinks in ASL. I have caught her signing to herself just like I sometimes talk to myself. For the first 5 years of my life I was technically deaf. I couldn't hear anything. I remember thinking by closing my eyes and imagining the thing I wanted to think. So I would close my eyes and see my own imaginary world. I can still do it but only in complete silence. It's a trait I will forever hold but I'm not mad at it. It can be very helpful in some situations. Hi, born profound deaf person here. Sorry for the long post. Before I got surgery for my cochlear implant, before learning ASL, I don't exactly recall knowing about any mental functionalities like using a thinking voice. Most of my mental uses were reimagining images and visual thoughts. If I wanted a hot dog, I'd visualize a hot dog. Besides that, my dreams were like silent films. And 95% still often are silent even after my surgery to help me hear. After that and being able to hear for some years, at some point, I developed an inner voice which just doesn't have any clear vocal sound to it, yet, at the same time, kind of does, kinda weird, hard to explain. It's a jump between muffled speaking sound as I think and hollow echoes for my normal thinking voice. And when I read fiction with characters, for those who have preset voiced I reimagine them in my head as to how they would act it out and it would sound just like the tone I'd hear from the media they're from. For the stories that aren't adapted into any audio format, I make them up in my head and try to make them sound distinct if I felt like it. Haha. My friends, nonsense, have told me they either don't mentally see/hear anything at all and have no idea the concept I'm trying to explain, or they visualize floating hands signing to them in their mind space. I don't think in the latter at all, except when there are signs I'm trying to remember. Reference. Also side note BTW, back to my dreams thing, I sometimes dream them with semi-transparent CC subtitles hovering what I'm seeing, sometimes at the bottom or near people's heads like in some video games just without the speech bubbles, or none at all, but my dreaming brain narrates my dreams to me, telling me info somehow. If that's a deaf thing though. But I've always found how I dream kind of fascinating. The very rare sounds I hear in my dreams is kind of hard to explain as well. I can't tell if they were close to authentic to a deaf person with hearing that my brain produced for my dream, or just my brain trying to reimagine the sound in my mental voice while I dream, but it felt like there was legit real sound to it, but on the disorienting, surreal side. I'm not sure why people are making fun of you. It's a legitimate question and I hope someone deaf can explain, but most thoughts we have are conceptual and they're not in words. So if they don't have an inner voice, I don't think they're missing much, but I have no idea if that's the case. A deafie here, naturally we can't even describe what it sounds like as we don't really understand sound in the way you do. Maybe the basics like deep and high pitches, but the difference between notes or octaves are something only understood through theory. That is reading about them. We don't understand what makes a singer good, but we for sure know how to tell if it's a good beat, provided it's loud enough to feel. As such, speaking for myself here, my inner voice is more literally like thinking, a mixture of instinctual understanding and the words that describe the meaning I want to express. I am a writer, so words are quite colorful to me. They convey a myriad of imagination. I also am a philosopher, so I admire and observe closely the metaphysics at play here. Words can occasionally come out in English as it is best expressed through English. Some come out as sign language as there are sayings that only make sense in sign language. It's a blend of both as well as the raw emotional output that form my thoughts. Also, there is the silence in between the thoughts. Depends on how much you pay attention, I suppose. I'm not deaf, but when I was learning ASL I began to think in ASL where essentially I could feel the muscle memory of the signs in my head. For example, without actually moving, think about what it feels like to raise your hand, clench a fist, or write with a pencil. That mental sensation of a recalled muscle movement was how ASL thoughts felt to me. Don't know if this is the same for deaf people, but I found it super intriguing when it started happening to me. The way we conceptualize thought differs from person to person. Some people have inner monologues, some people don't. I imagine deaf people are more likely to not have an inner monologue. I asked my niece this. She said she had an inner voice, but it was more a feeling than a voice. She described it as feeling the vibrations from loud music. When she had her surgery, and she heard voices for the first time, her inner voice adapted. A neurologist named Oliver Sacks wrote a book called Seeing Voices. It was prescribed reading when I studied South African Sign Language. It might give some insights to your question. I have a follow-up question related to this. Do people, who are born deaf, pronounce the words they read in their head, or do you simply see the word and imagine something related to it, not sure how to put it in words correctly? Not all deaf people do sign language. There's quite a few of us who just tries to speak as normally as possible like everyone else. In my case I am completely deaf. Cannot hear a damn thing without my hearing aids. However, I have an inner voice like the vast majority of people. Sometimes I even have conversations or raise questions with it whenever I'm thinking, and yes, I can't hear it in my head. It's not like a silent movie. When I close my eyes, I can visualize objects and people. Even with my eyes open I can visualize things. When I am making or doing something I can visualize how it is going to look right in front of me. Pretty useful in sports. When I dream things are being acted out. Usually from my vantage point, I talk to other people in dreams, interact with objects, run, jump, fly, fall. Sometimes the vantage point changes and I'm looking at myself doing things. I can perceive colors such as I can see the person holding a blue umbrella or the dog is brown, but it is not very vivid. It's almost hazy. Sometimes my inner voice joins my dreams. Like everyone dreams they are very random. Sometimes vivid, sometimes not. When dreaming I can hear sounds like explosions, screams, laughter. I even hear and create music. Seriously, the music I make in my head is pretty damn good. If that manifested in reality I would be the best musician in the world, but sadly I never learned to play any instruments. I often listen to music in my head whilst I'm falling asleep. Sometimes I just can't turn it off and struggle to sleep. I have read that their dreams have people make hand signs, so I guess their mind voice will also be more physical based. I once learned a new language with unique script due to necessity. To increase practice I would mentally write the word I hear to acclimate what letters are there in the word. 10 years hence even now though I don't use that language that much, when someone speaks words I make a mental picture of reading those words, not sure if those are related, but thought that's how it would work. Fun fact, I'm not deaf or born deaf, but I've recently learned that not everybody, even with intact hearing, has this voice in their head. I was baffled as I always thought everyone has a voice if they're thinking. Deaf profound ear, did surgery on right ear at 2. Later left ear at 14 or so. I have inner voice whole time, never ASL. I learned basic of ASL in high school, so not surprised. Consider I start hearing sound when very young. It's a good question. I suppose that's related to how we was raised. If we was raised doing ASL, then we might ASL in our head, otherwise voice. Wait. You guys don't have narrators narrating in your head? Not deaf, but I have a small voice that sometimes echoes thought to me. But almost all of my other thoughts are imagery. Like I imagine stuff all the time and barely ever do stuff. But I can have a half-decent convo with a voice, but I kinda choose what it says. I recently learned that deaf people, at least in my country, often speak sign language as their first language and do not appreciate the assumption that sign language is just a sign form of the country's language. The two languages usually have different grammars and morphology. I think your question is very interesting, Op. I just wanted to add to it. Maybe this helps understand that not everyone has an acoustic language as their inner voice. I think it's hard for a hearing person to grasp this concept because language is so bound to sound for us, but as Steven Pinker said, we shouldn't make the mistake of mixing up thought and language. Most of our thoughts are more diffused than language. Was born profoundly deaf. Wore hearing aids from 6 months old and replaced it with a cochlear implant at 15. I only have one, don't hear out of the other ear unless I opt to get another one for bilateral hearing. I was never taught how to sign. I was raised in a hearing world. People don't even realize I'm deaf most of the time until they see the implant. I'm a bit of an outlier, I guess. I'm not involved in the deaf community, though I do have a couple of deaf friends who both talk and sign. My voice sounds a lot cooler in my head than what it really is, probably the same for most people, lol. I'm profoundly deaf and got a cochlear implant at the age of 2 and was raised oral. Didn't learn British Sign Language till about 11 years old-ish. I do have an inner voice because I have spoken since the age of 3, so basically had a similar start as a hearing person, almost, I'm guessing. And I've always loved reading when growing up, so always been very literate. Not like some deaf people who are native BSL users, usually, but obviously can't speak for all, although I do speak better than I can hear, if that makes sense. So my inner voice is pretty much my voice, but as I have started to wear my cochlear implant considerably less, like almost never, my voice is slightly different. A bit more distorted, but I still think in words and have a voice narrating my thoughts. My dream is a mixture of speaking and just pure visuals, although I haven't really remembered my dreams all that much recently. I have a circle of deaf friends and their experiences really do vary. I will ask my partner, who is also deaf, to post her experiences on this post too. 50% of the population doesn't have an inner voice and sees everything in pictures, so let's say somebody wants to go and get milk, I'll say it out loud in my head, other people will see themselves getting milk. Maybe deaf people have that. Interesting fact, there are actually a lot of people who don't have an inner voice, and instead think in video or picture format. When they read, they don't read it and they run. It's ran back like a movie. Not deaf but have studied psychology. People born deaf who also suffer from auditory hallucinations tend to not hear voices, they rather see floating hands speaking to them in sign language. I just remembered this fact because of your post. Even though it's not an answer to your question in any way. Hey y'all, I'm hard of hearing, got hearing aids, had them since I was 2 years old. I would say I always had an inner voice, but later on when I started going to a deaf school and learn ASL, sometimes it would be sign, sometimes not. I would also talk to myself by talking or signing. I do want to note that I am not deaf. But some people even with fully functional hearing do not have an inner voice. In my own experience, this made it difficult for me to read in elementary school, and people will often think in concepts or images instead. Just as extra information in case nobody else has mentioned it, because I know lots of people find it interesting / mind-blowing. Not everyone has an inner voice, aka internal monologue, regardless of their hearing abilities. There was a whole big thing about it about a year ago, with many follow-ups since then. Here is a post from February last year about the topic in general, and another more focused on what it's like for the people who don't have one. Not deaf here. I was curious to see the answers, and then I started to think of how my inner voice sounds like, and I don't think it has a sound at all. I feel like there's a narrator, but there's no audible voice. Damn, our minds work so weirdly. Not deaf, but sign language has a different syntax than English, but they can read English. It just gives them headaches because English sentence syntax is different than how ASL English sentences are represented, so I would theorize that they have English word thoughts, but just in a different word order than mainstream, proper English. This is interesting. I'm not deaf, but my thinking voice is not my own. I have a deep voice, and it will put a bit of effort to think in my head with my own voice. My thinking voice is still male, but a bit soft and not in my native accent. How about the others? My dad is deaf. He said he thinks partially in non-sign and also in sign. Since I had two deaf parents, I used to think only in English, but since learning to sign over the past 5 years-ish from my dad more deeply, I knew signs, but I never really tried. Always tried to fingerspell because my mom is a bad person, so I didn't really care, and I wasn't around my dad until I was 25 due to her basically. I also sometimes think in sign language now. It's a weird feeling, thinking in sign. I am not deaf, but I have a couple of memories from before I had words. Even without words, we have concepts and memories. We know stuff from experience and have the idea of what happened in our memories, if not labels for things. Just like when you can't recall the word to describe a particular thing, but you know the thing and the word exist. We have the concept in our brains without words. If we are missing a sense, then we cannot have the experience that goes with that sense, but we still have the other senses to understand. Words are only needed to communicate to others, not with ourselves. If you think about when you dream, sometimes you are not yourself, but you have a full backstory. You just know without having words to tell you. You just know. Purely out of curiosity, how would someone with little to no concept of sound describe a sound? Do you relate it to some other sensation? Deaf person here but has hearing aids that make me hear just fine, but was deaf for the first 3 years of my life. My inner voice feels like a different personality to my actual self. It's like some Dr. Jekyll nonsense or something, because it's a more confident version of myself. One thing that is definitely noticeable is I can literally create worlds and scenarios in an instant with different voices that are identical to people I know, if they are people I know, I suppose. It's a bit odd, but it's my mind, so I wouldn't get rid of it. Not the op here, checking in. Super interesting to read from the part of someone actually born deaf. Really made me think about how actually crazy and amazing it is that we recall sounds, and have an inner voice inside of our head, play music inside of our heads. Such an incredible thing that we at least I, take for granted. Probably interesting to point out that not everyone thinks with an inner voice. I'm not deaf and I don't really have one. When reading, I tend to almost say words in my head, but when thinking, my thoughts are not sentences nor are they speaking. It's more a web of interconnected ideas that cascade as I process them. Also, FYI, I don't technically have a hearing problem, but sometimes when there's a lot of noises occurring at the same time, I'll hear them as one big jumble. Again, it's not that I can't hear, because that's false. I can. I just can't distinguish between everything I'm hearing. I'm mostly hearing, but I just tried to quantify what my inner voice sounds like, and I can't even do that. Like, I don't hear anything when I speak in my head as I type this. I guess I whisper in my head, are we supposed to sound like the voice we hear or a recorded voice that we never think sounds like us? Or can someone's inner voice be a totally different character? Like, can Robin Williams voice my inner voice if I wanted? I studied ASL in college, and after a couple hours of immersion where we only signed, I would definitely be thinking in sign rather than English. I thought it was really cool. I'd describe it like when you plan motions such as thinking through a basketball shot or getting ready to jump over something, but as a fluid transition from one planned motion to another, forming sentences and complex ideas.